Hello and welcome to The Entrepreneurs on Monocle Radio, the show all about inspiring people, innovative companies and fresh ideas in global business. On today's programme, how smart leaders can turn crisis into opportunity. First, we'll hear how the 2008 financial crash inspired a Norwegian founder to rethink traditional investment models and focus on tackling key global challenges.
I was a winner in the system. I was in private equity, I was sitting on top of the food chain and being ignorant around what was happening in the world around me. So it was more of a wake-up call of we have to have a system change.
Then we'll find out how a health scare led to a career shift for the founder of a German company making a positive impact, one presentation at a time.
I decided to go away, think about why I ended up in hospital, and then start writing down my findings and develop 9 principles for better presenting.
This is The Entrepreneurs, with me, Tom Edwards. You're listening to The Entrepreneurs. Reynir Indahl is the managing partner of Summa Equity, a purpose-driven private equity firm that invests in companies addressing global challenges. Since founding the firm in 2016, Reynir has led its mission to generate both financial returns and positive social and environmental impact, aligning with the UN Sustainable Development Goals along the way. Reynir popped by Midori House to discuss his vision for the future of investing as the company continues to grow. He began by telling me how the 2008 financial crisis was a wake-up call that things needed to change.
Yeah, that was a shocking moment. I did my undergrad at Wharton, did my MBA at Harvard, and then worked for McKinsey for a few years before venturing into private equity. I was a bit surprised, as everyone was, about the financial crisis. So I wanted to get my money back from Harvard. I mean, it didn't teach me anything useful to see it's coming. But then I really had to sort of dig deep in why did the financial crisis come? And I had discussions, everything with Joseph Stiglitz and other really knowledgeable people on the topic. I got more and more concerned about how growth is being driven in the world and the externalities it was creating, how we were destroying the planet doing so and also increasing social inequality. I was a winner in the system. I was in private equity, I was sitting on top of the food chain and being ignorant around what was happening in the world around me. So it was more of a wake-up call of we have to have a system change. The system that we have produced is not creating the planet we want and the communities we want. In hindsight, I was really shocked that I hadn't seen that really.
Well, it's interesting. And look, we talk to a lot of entrepreneurial people. One of the questions I always ask them is, lots of people maybe have that moment of reflection, of introspection, of questioning, but a vanishingly small number then say, right, I'm going to fix, I'm going to address, so that at least I can live with myself and I can feel I'm delivering on these intentionalities and to try and get these outcomes. Why was that the case for you? Because I'm sure there are lots of people also at the top of the food chain that didn't have that moment to stop. They didn't seek the insights of people, perhaps even better qualified than them. Why is that? Is that just your nature, Reynir? Is this what you were like? I don't know, even as a kid, you were curious about the world, you wanted to understand how things worked, why they didn't. Why are you in this small minority who did decide to try and do something?
Well, I always like to dig into things and understand things that I don't understand. So that was one part of it. But if you look at my upbringing, so I grew up in northern Norway. My father was a doctor. His father was a fisherman. So as a doctor, we had to move. We lived in some of the smaller communities. It was just, living in small community, having had a history of living with nature and surviving from nature and fishing. It is sort of a value system, right? So what kind of world do you want to live in? So when I started to dig into this, I think I read everything on the subject, on both climate change, on social inequality, philosophy, religion. So I really dive deep, and of course around our financial system and how money is created and debt and growth and all of that. And it was a journey. So it didn't happen in 2009, just, I saw the financial crisis and then had to change my life. It took 2, 3, 4 years where I really tried to grapple with the issues. And then there was a moment where I remember I was sitting in a meeting room in a meeting. And then one of the other ones came up to me afterwards and what has happened? I turned completely white. And that was because at that moment, I realized I couldn't be doing what I'm doing. But it was a journey to get there.
Well, let's talk a bit about that journey then. You drafted your vision, and as you said, it unfolded over a number of years, but by 2015 you're in a position to try to communicate what your plan of action was to address these fundamentally unequal systems of operation in a very hands-on way. And in a very, and I mean this as a compliment, in a quite a prescriptive way. And this is obviously the origin then of the fund and, of course, the foundation and some of the other ancillaries. Is that how long it takes to go from this moment of questioning? You know, it just shows you can't like operate a lever. It takes years to ferment the idea and then to deliver a framework. Did you feel you'd sort of done that as swiftly as you could?
Well, so the moment I mentioned when I realized I had to leave what I was doing was in 2013. So obviously it took a couple of years before pivoting into something new. So I decided to leave private equity. I went into the board of LGT Venture Philanthropy, which is the philanthropic foundation of the princely family of Liechtenstein. They asked me to help them with the strategy of LGT Venture Philanthropy. So I got to meet a few of the impact investment funds, quite small at that point, but also to work with philanthropy. And when I was going around to India, to Brazil, to Africa, and really looking at some of the great entrepreneurs that were creating companies which are really solving some of our challenges, and then discussing with some of these impact funds on how they were thinking, the whole narrative at that point was that if you are backing a company which is doing something good for the world, you lose money on it. But that was actually not the case, because I saw all of these companies, and the companies that had the best impact and were really doing something unique and were growing and were doing well, were also the best financially performing ones. So the whole narrative that this is a trade-off, I didn't really see in those companies. And then I read a book by Albert Hirschman called Exit Voice Loyalty, and it's about the choices you make in life. And it could be economic choices, political choices. And I had essentially taken an exit from private equity and capitalism as such, because I felt it was a system I couldn't be loyal to. So those were the two choices, you know, do I stay or do I go? But there is a third choice, and that's to be a voice. And to be a voice, you have to be relevant and you have to be in the system. You can't sort of be outside, because then you're not relevant. And when I was seeing these companies and the challenges that we have and what problems we need to solve, and this has to happen in business. Our politicians are not going to solve it. The government is not going to solve it. So then I became convinced that why not go back into private equity, create a thematic strategy, focusing on companies that are solving our challenges, and prove to the world that this will give you higher returns, not lower returns.
And this is, I guess, your kind of PE 4.0, this very fundamental idea that you can create more value with less risk and do good. But then this surely prompts the question, why isn't this the way that, you know, why does it have to be an S&I strategy or an ESG compliance strategy or a strategy that addresses the UN SDGs? Why can't this just be the way that investing works? Because it performs better and it does good. Can we ever get to the point where this is normalized truly across the whole investment landscape?
I think it's starting to get normalized. We have done over the last years, we've sold 6 companies, and they've all been sold at a premium to the peer groups. And they have been bought by some strategics, some other private equity funds that don't have impact or sustainability focus. So I think the whole investment community is starting to look at, we do have some fundamental challenges, right? And if you're a company that is creating these challenges and adding to these problems, you will get penalized. Already now, with carbon tax being introduced in Europe, you're being penalized on it. And if you're going to have a future-proof company that do well and have a growth story, you'd rather be having the tailwind of the mega trends. So I think this is really starting to get normalized. It wasn't back then, and I think a lot of investors were quite skeptical to our strategy and why focus on sustainability. Now I feel it's been mainstreamed.
Absolutely. And I guess what's encouraging is the pace at which that mainstreaming has happened, because that narrative of doing good costs, it was very pervasive for a lot longer than it should have been. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts of some of these investments then. I know that you mentioned megatrends, and there's a few that you sort of zero in on, looking at kind of resource efficiency. We know we're in a world where resources are scarce, demography, shifts in demographics, and the transformative power of technology, I suppose, would be perhaps the third. Maybe it would be instructive, Reynir, can you give us an example? Maybe you would prefer to talk about an exit or a current live investment. I don't know, it's up to you, but that actually sort of demonstrates your system working perfectly, so our listeners can really understand not just the abstraction, but how it actually really works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm passionate about waste. And I guess none of us like waste, but that's why I'm passionate about solving that challenge.
Somebody has to be. That's the point, right?
So one of our first investments that we did was buying a company called Sortera in Sweden. So Sortera was a small waste and recycling company focusing on the building sector, having these builder bags and containers. So if you're doing refurbishing or doing a building construction. And they made all of the money collecting these waste and these builder bags. And then they had a cost of getting rid of the waste afterwards. So what we did was that it was still small. So we needed scale in order to invest in sorting and recycling equipment. So we acquired 10 of the competitors. We also expanded geographically in Sweden, so not only being in Stockholm, but in Gothenburg, Malmö. And then we built and invested in the most advanced sorting and recycling site in Sweden, because then we had the scale. So when we sold it, it also made money downstream. And what's a better business model if you get paid to pick up the waste, you do something with it, and you earn money selling it as material? It became almost 6 times larger in revenues when we sold it, and we made over 8 times the money on our investment in Sortera. So that was really transforming something into being fully recyclable. It was also named the 11th most sustainable company in Sweden of all companies. There wasn't any waste companies even near that. So we also changed some of the narrative around what's a dirty industry, and which people have a really bad perception of.
Listeners can't see this, but you're beaming with pride, Reynir. It's good to try and communicate that, taking such pride in that kind of accomplishment. You mentioned earlier about the lack of investment, and I don't mean necessarily financial investment, but political capital, if you like, in delivering these fixes. And you were alluding, I guess, to the short-termism of politics. It's very difficult for somebody who maybe is thinking about a 3, 4, 5-year political lifespan to invest deeply in something where the benefits are generational. And you said, look, I'm very easy about PE or business leading that change because they need to. But can we really scale things? Even the business you've described, that worked effectively. There's a lot of social capital in Sweden, Finland, Norway. So one may argue, despite greater costs, that it's maybe easier to do something like that in those markets. They're more advanced. There's a greater collective awareness of what needs to happen. Can we drive scale, the necessary scale, to address the challenges we face? If we look at waste, it's the tip of an iceberg, right? And if we don't address it in the UK or Germany or Eastern Europe or in the developing world, we're just kind of scratching at the surface. How do you retain your optimism that the kinds of work you're doing will make a big enough difference when the scale of the challenge is so vast?
It's a great question, and it's a difficult question.
I like to ask tricky ones sometimes. I was giving you an easy ride so far,
No, but if you look at, so let me, in all of these areas that we focus on, we start with what the problem is and what is the future state that we should have. So going back to your question and my passion for waste. So we published last year our thesis on theory of change for how we can get a circular economy in Europe. And if you start with the problem, the CO2 emissions from waste and from end-of-life material is 22% of our emissions in Europe. So it's a larger number than I actually knew, because no one has put a number on it before we did this work. It's one of our biggest emissions. And we were looking at all the existing technologies in sorting, in recycling, and how to make useful products out of recycled materials, whether that's sustainable aviation fuel or energy. And then looking at how much would it cost in Europe to deploy all of these technologies, and what would the effect be? If I go to the effect first, we can decarbonize this 22% by 55%. So we go down to 10% emissions. And we can be 80% self-sufficient in the materials we have in our production in Europe. And we create a lot of jobs. So we can get back on the Paris Agreement. We could be pretty much self-sufficient on material, and we will create a booming economy and a lot of jobs. We would need to invest 230 billion euros, which sounds like a big number, but it's not. It's 1.5% of 1 year's GDP. And if you spread this until 2040, which we predicted, it's less than 0.1% of GDP per year. And then we were also looking at how much revenues would it create, how much profits, what should that profit be worth. And the value creation opportunity is 1.5 trillion euros. So that's almost 6-7 times your money. I mean, who wouldn't take that?
Hang on, but this is the point. Who wouldn't take that? the current leadership of everywhere in Europe. And if we look at the direction of travel,
and
so how do we ensure, other than saying, right, Reynir, you're in charge, it's a pan-political operation, you're going to parachute in, maybe literally to Brussels, and tell these people, look, this is what we're doing. How we can't get the buy-in, even though it is an absolute no-brainer. What do we do?
And that's why your question is a great question and also a very, very difficult one. Because there is no silver bullet. So, I mean, it's obvious we should be doing this for so many reasons, and it's not happening. If you take the broader picture, I was looking at the numbers now, we need to invest $5.5 trillion per year in capex to go to net zero. We are currently investing 1.4 trillion, which is doubling what we did in 2019. So it's growing, but with a 4 trillion gap. So, we're investing a fourth of what we should be investing. So we're not on track. On the business side, we have to go from where we are suppliers and customers, where we are competitors, to building consortiums that can create the scale necessary. We also need a government who penalizes the emissions and creates a more level playing field. And we need more financing for scale up of these green technologies. So there's some kind of de-risking or funding. And it's been a difficult fundraising market, especially for growth companies over the last couple of years. So I think we need to completely transform how we've done business. It needs to be much more public-private partnerships. It needs to be consortiums where you cross the boundaries of what's a supplier and what's a customer and what's a competitor. So this is what we have to transform. So it's a system change. So while we can do this in Sortera and do great, that's one company doing one thing. But if you're going to change the system, you're talking about a completely different level, which is much more difficult. And that's why things are going really slow.
But they're speeding up a little bit. We have to try and remain optimistic. One final thought, Reynir, then. If someone's listened to this and thinks, again, this really strikes a chord with me. I don't know, maybe they are operating their own PE fund, maybe they're an investor, a business owner. Let's hope maybe they're in public service, maybe they're in City Hall or in central government, and they think, this speaks to me. What should people do? I mean, is it a question, I guess you'd like them to get in touch with you and see about working together, or maybe they run a business that might be of interest to invest in. But what do you think? Because I think one of the problems is that people say, yeah, look, this really resonates with me, but I'm just one person. I'm running an SME. Yeah. I can't move the needle, even like Reynir has done. What would you say to them?
Everyone can move the needle. So it only takes a few committed people to change the world. I think it was Margaret Mead that said that. And it's the only thing that ever has happened, she said. So I think everyone can move the needle. I think everyone should work for a company that is truly purpose-driven, that they're aligned with the mission of that company. The disruption we're going through now is much bigger than the .com disruption or the AI disruption that's happening, because it's a disruption of our whole physical infrastructure. So it's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur, because this shift is happening quite fast and it has to happen. So I see so many great technologies out there which are on an exponential scale, which will transform it. Be an entrepreneur, find a company that is purpose-driven, that's aligned with what challenge you really want to be part of solving, and be a conscious consumer where you buy stuff which, can actually be recycled and which is healthy for you and good. So everyone can move the needle.
That was Reynir Indahl, the founder and managing partner of Summa Equity. And you can find out more about the business by heading to summaequity.com. Next, we head to Germany, via Switzerland. Marcus John Henry Brown is the founder of Speakery, a Munich-based company that trains international speakers to deliver powerful presentations in English and German. With over 30 years of business experience as a performance artist, Marcus has guided hundreds of non-native English speakers, from politicians to entrepreneurs, to earn standing ovations worldwide. This month, he's also hosting the Speakery Summit, a 2-day boutique conference in the Bavarian Alps, showcasing top speakers and expert presenters, including Monocle's own Emma Nelson. Emma and Marcus caught up at our Zurich HQ, and Emma began by asking him about the biggest mistake one can make in a presentation.
The biggest mistake I think that anybody can make when they walk up on stage in front of an audience is to have not practiced, that they literally don't know what it is they're going to do and why they're there. Now, this normally happens to men. Men do this Women tend not to, because women tend to work much, much harder at what they do, because that's kind of what they've been programmed to do, or what they think they've been programmed to do. But men, we don't care. We can wing it. We can do anything we want to do. So that's the biggest mistake that most people make, particularly men. They never practice. They just wing it. And then about halfway through, they realize they don't know what they're doing. They haven't prepared for it properly, and they don't have an end. So not having the end is actually the biggest mistake that any speaker can make.
Tell me a little bit about how you got into the practice of actually training people to present, because you have to be a pretty good presenter before you start, or do you?
I think you do. Yeah, I think it's incredibly useful to actually be able to do what you're telling people. I studied art, focused on performance art. And when I moved to Germany 30 years ago, I ended up in advertising, which is a bit of an occupational hazard for any artist. And I hated advertising, but I loved presenting and pitching. So I started to merge the two of those things and began putting performance art on business conference stages. And through the process of doing those things, these very, very strange presentations that would confuse people, anger people, I actually had 20 people walk out of a presentation that I was doing in protest for what I was doing.
What were you doing?
I was doing a performance which was called The Passing for the Art Directors Club Europe in Barcelona in 2018. And 20 members of the audience decided that it was rubbish and decided to get up and go. So as a speaker coach, I've made all of the mistakes that my mentees don't have to do anymore. So I can guide them through these ridiculous mistakes that I've made in the past and show them a much, much more effective way of engaging with an audience and delighting them.
It sounds like you've had to learn your craft the hard way. Is that correct?
Yes, very much so. Lots of tears, lots of pain, lots of all the things that pretty much everybody is afraid of. So confronting them head on and taking a huge amount of risks. So that's the advantage of putting art on a stage in front of 1,000 people. But the real challenge is to put a presentation that actually means something to the audience, to the people on the stage, so that they can go away and use the information that I've given them or that the speaker's given them, so that it actually has an impact on their own lives or on the businesses that they're running.
Give me an example of that.
Well, in my case, it would be going on stage and talking for 35 minutes about how anybody can become a stellar keynote speaker, and then taking them through the principles and the things that they would all need to do to up their speaker game. So that would be one example of what that would be. But it could be anything from the CEO of an NGO explaining why their NGO is important and why we should be funding them. Or a startup company pitching for investor money. So all of those things actually have an impact on the life of the speaker and potentially the life of the people in the audience.
What was it that then made you decide that, having learnt the hard way in terms of presentation, that you could actually turn this into a company? Because there are dozens, if not hundreds of people who have stepped on a stage or stepped in front of an audience of some kind and have absolutely died up there, and have then decided that never, ever, ever again will they be seen dead in front of a group of people. You, on the other hand, thought, I'm going to make this a company. What happened there?
Well, a number of things. First of all, it wasn't my idea. It was an idea of a customer of mine. So she'd been watching the performances and asked, could you teach my cybersecurity engineers how to do just 1% of that, just a little bit? Just teach them how to go on stage without fear and tell a story that other people can understand. So it wasn't actually my idea. It was an idea of a customer's. So that was the first kind of moment. I think a lot of entrepreneurs understand that it's not just one decision. There's lots and lots of tiny little things that happen at any given time. So that was the first one. The second one was I ended up in hospital after my last performance. I was rushed in because I thought I was having a heart attack. Turned out I was just having a severe case of indigestion, but it was caused because of the stress I was going through from a performance that took over 6 months, tens of thousands of euros to create. I put it on stage and it didn't really resonate with the audience. And I upset myself. I got my knickers in the twist so badly that I put myself into hospital. And I decided to go away, stop this nonsense, think about why I ended up in hospital, and then start writing down my findings. And slowly and surely, I developed 9 principles for better presenting in a way that keeps you out of hospital, that keeps you healthy and keeps you happy on stage so that you can actually start to enjoy it. So those were the 2 kind of fundamental moments that led to founding the company that I now run.
9 principles sounds like an awful lot to remember.
Yes, don't ask me to run through them now. The main principle is audience obsession. This is the cornerstone of my company. It's the thing that everybody has to understand who comes and work with me, that it's not about you. In fact, I think there's a video of Kamala Harris actually talking to a young woman who's about to go on stage. She's very nervous, and she says, it's not about you. It's about the audience, about what's in your head, and translating it in such a way that the audience will understand why it's important to them. So audience obsession is the one that matters most to me. And by focusing on the audience, the speaker starts to forget themselves.
Do you think that quite a lot of people forget that they're talking to an audience? That I mean, some people say that, for example, journalists don't exist. That all they do is they act as a walking microphone or pen. But spokespeople actually do think too much about themselves, and as a result, they end up with their knickers in a twist, or they end up in hospital.
Absolutely. That's the biggest mistake after not having an end, is to just constantly focusing on yourself, worrying about yourself. There's a lot of kind of personal baggage that everybody takes up on stage with them when they present, or when they sit in front of a microphone like I'm doing now. They're constantly thinking about me. Am I making a fool of myself? Will I expose myself? Will I damage my business? All of these things. And these things come from somewhere. They come from experiences from our childhood, or from growing up, going through school. So by focusing on the audience, by trying to understand what it is they need to hear, what is the one thing that this presentation is about that will have an impact on their lives, by focusing on that, you forget yourself, and the nerves slowly but surely disappear.
Tell me a little bit about how you went from recovery from a very bad bout of indigestion and an existential crisis to actually turning it into a company, because there are lots and lots of people out there around the world who claim to be able to do what you do, which is to make people able to present, remove their nerves, etc., etc. How did you manage to persuade the people who funded you that you were worth investing in? And how did you go about that process? How did you get the money to get things going?
Well, I'm bootstrapped. So the only people I'm having to convince are paying customers, which is very, very important to me personally. That's how I approach or have approached building the business over the last 10 years. I think the main difference is the mix. It's the experience. It's 30 years of being a madman on one hand and being this bonkers performance artist on the other hand, making a fool of himself on stage in front of thousands of people, and being able to share the experiences that I've had in real life situations with people who have an immediate urgency. So people call me when the shit's hitting the fan, right? That they have a presentation that they have to do next week and they panic and they need somewhere to go. Because of the people I'm working with, they tend to pass on my business details and say, this is where you need to go. So I don't offer courses. I offer emergency help when required. I think that's probably the best way of describing it. And it seems to work as well. So by working very, very close to a date where there is an immediate urgency, there is razor-sharp focus on the part of the customer because they really, really, really want to get it right. And that makes it much easier for me to help them because their concentration levels are much, much higher than if they come in every week.
Tell me a little bit, though, about the fact that what you have just described seems to be quite a, as you say, bootstrapped, almost precarious business model. And what you said right at the beginning of this interview is that the most important thing that you have to do is prepare. So how do those two things meet?
Yes, it's precarious, but it's not chance. I mean, there is a lot of planning that has gone into building the services over time. I've made a lot of mistakes about the things I've offered. I did at the beginning think it would be a really good idea to offer courses where people would come in once a week, but that simply didn't work. That's not what my customers actually need. And the company is now old enough that I can plan around certain events. The event calendar is robust enough to offer a certain degree of planning. So I know that the beginning of the year up until May is going to be a busy period. Then summer is quiet in terms of conferences and internal work within public sector corporations. And then in autumn, it goes bonkers again. So there is a certain degree of planning that I can do around that.
One conference you have organised is your own, the Speakery Summit. Tell me why that was something that you believed needed to be done and what's in it.
Conferences are ghastly. They are horrible things with lots of why and lots of inspiration, which nobody wants anymore. We're really sick of that. There's too many sponsors pushing their brand of what and not enough how. I was actually sat last year in the Quality of Life conference in Munich. I was expecting good, but I didn't expect it to be as good as it was. It's quite literally the best thing I've ever been to. And I was just thinking why that was. It was not only because it has the lightness of hand that you would expect from Monocle, but it was perfectly curated. The productions levels were unusual, restrained, but on point, perfect conversations. But it was the intimacy that I found so interesting. And that was where the idea for the summit was born. How can I take something as intimate as the Quality of Life conference, match it up with the intimacy of a speaker training session, and then offer that to a maximum of 40 people? And it turns out that I can do that in the Bavarian Alps, which is exactly what I'm doing. So 90 minutes away from Munich, we're putting on a tiny boutique conference for people who want to improve their public speaking and press work and presentation skills with 10 fantastic external experts.
Who do you want to come to this? Because you say it's absolutely teeny tiny, but you don't want it too tiny, do you?
No, not too tiny. There are bills to pay. I'm bootstrapping it all, as I usually do. No, people are buying tickets, CEOs, business owners, communications people. So it's people who take it seriously, people who really, really want to work hard and find out how they can generally get better at it and work very, very closely with experts to work on their particular problems. So they all come up to the mountain with problems, and we send them all back down to base camp with a whole bunch of answers on how to do it.
That was Marcus John Henry Brown, the founder of Speakery, in conversation with Monocle's Emma Nelson. And you can find out more and secure tickets for the Speakery Summit by heading to speakery.de. And that's it for this episode of The Entrepreneurs on Monocle Radio. We'll be back at the same time next week. Do look out for Eureka, available every Friday. The programme was produced by Laura Kramer with audio editing by Jack Dewars. You can listen again and find out more, as always, at monocle.com. You can follow us and catch up with the archive via your preferred podcast platform, so do subscribe and rate the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. To contact the team, email Laura at lrk@monocle.com. I'm Tom Edwards. Goodbye, and thanks for listening to The Entrepreneurs.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at FT.com.